This edition of the Mode Push podcast, we jump into the U.S. Grand Prix, the winners and losers of the whole thing. What a race it was. Dan Jimenez is going to break down some of the people who have been amazingly disappointing and amazingly amazing this year on the F1 grid. We've got tons to talk about. It's right now on Mode Push.
Radio check. Loud and clear.
KSL Sports and KSL Podcast present Mode Push, an American view of F1, starting now.
One stop, he's looking good with his honestly.
I'm gutted. I'm absolutely gutted.
I enjoyed this so much. Thank you.
It's a victory that will give Red Bull the Constructors' Championship in 2022. It's celebrations for team and for driver on such a poignant weekend. Max Verstappen wins the United States Grand Prix. Still not over. Vettel in his final United States Grand Prix. Has he got the move done? No, not quite. George Russell takes the fastest lap of the race now. He's got the move done. The fireworks are going off. And on the track, Sebastian Vettel still giving his explosive action. Norris 6th, Alonso 7th. Sebastian Vettel comes home to finish 8th.
There it is. I had to throw in Sebastian Vettel's final U.S. Grand Prix finish there as well. Welcome on in. It's Mode Push. Alex, Kirry, Dan Jimenez, fresh off of a U.S. Grand Prix weekend, and it was a fun one. This was it was an excitement filled race. It had all sorts of things going on. It had a high speed crash, which nobody really wants to see unless no one gets hurt, and then you go, show me the replay. It's exactly where we were yesterday. Dan Jimenez joining me as he always does on the Mode Push podcast. Your thoughts right off the bat from the U.S. Grand Prix in Austin. The Circuit of the Americas delivered a pretty fun race for us yesterday.
Yeah, bravo to Circuit of the Americas. That was a great race. Top 2, top 3 race of the season. Maybe Silverstone, was maybe a little bit up there in terms of level of excitement. But yeah, like you said, just great on-track action, thanks to a few safety cars. And then lots of news around the paddock before and even after the race. It's going to take 24 hours from the checkered flag for everyone to process kind of what just happened. It was a great race.
The off-the-track stuff that happened before the race, everything that we kind of watched walking up to this thing, you saw the cost cap stuff ended up winding down. But once the drivers showed up to the track, you saw Red Bull getting harassed quite a bit by some of the fans, by some of the Mercedes and or McLaren and or whomever else. Everybody who's not Red Bull fans yelling at, chanting cheaters while they're doing interviews, things like that. What ended up becoming of the kind of what we ended up figuring out from all that? Because then you also had those awkward moments where Christian Horner sitting up on the interview podium before the races and talking with some of these other principals who are just calling him out right in front of him and kind of staring down the camera. Is F1 in a better place after this last weekend from an off-track standpoint because of what was figured out with the penalties that came along with the cost cap breaches?
Oh, I think so. I think the drama on and off the track this weekend caught a ton of attention for just, worldwide fandom, but especially the U.S. fans. I'm surprised at how many Lewis fans there are in the U.S. Based on the post-race interviews, it just seemed like everybody there was a Mercedes fan cheering for Lewis, which I guess I didn't previously have a huge understanding of what that, where does the fandom lie in the US amongst existing drivers. But I thought there'd be a little bit more Red Bull support just given the prominence of the brand here in the US. But to the cost cap stuff, oh my gosh, Christian Horner's up there saying, this is getting bad. People are getting harassed. Kids are getting bullied at recess
of
school.
The team members, yeah.
Yeah, kids of the team members are getting bullied. And Toto's response is, yeah, I almost shed a tear when Christian said that. It's just...
oh, my gosh.
It's so harsh.
I love it.
Toto gives zero room for Christian. And so the rumored penalty is a 25% reduction in wind tunnel time. And just to remind all the listeners, the amount of wind tunnel time you get depends on where you finish the year. And so Red Bull finishes first, they already get the least amount. And then it's like 45% of the average time. And then like, Williams or whoever finishes last gets like 125% of the average time. So if they take a 25% reduction off that 45%, you're talking 20% of, what everyone else gets on average. And it's almost half as much what, say, Ferrari in third or Mercedes in third is going to get. And so that's pretty significant. I think that wind tunnel time is really going to hurt them if that's what the penalty ends up being.
It's going to get interesting. I mean, and that's what the sport needs, frankly, because you have how many races left? We have 3 races left in the rest of the season, and frankly, the Constructors title wrapped up, and then the World Driver Championship wrapped up, and so for the last 3 races, you watch something totally different. You get to see if the jockeying for position between Alpine and McLaren gets more interesting. You start to look and see if Checo can maybe that back and forth he's had with Charles Leclerc. Like you start to wonder. You have to look at these other things, right? And maybe Max will get and he certainly will in these last 3 races. You would think that he's going to break the single season win record. Where does that stand on historic performances, do you think? Because I was watching it in the graphic has all time. It's 13 wins in a season. Sebastian Vettel did it at one point in his career. Michael Schumacher did it at one point in his career. And then Max Verstappen. You think about the dominance that Lewis has had during that time that Mercedes won, those 8 constructor titles in a row before this year. And so that's a historic performance. But, like, perspective-wise, Dan, give us an idea of, like, what type of a year this was over the grand scheme of great years for singular drivers in F1 history.
Yeah, I would say this is perhaps the most dominant year we've ever seen in Formula One, both from a car and a driver perspective. I mean, I thought that Max was going to kind of lay over yesterday after that pit stop snafu, because he came out, 5 seconds behind Hamilton, and on tires that weren't going to last as long. And I was like, well, he's already got it all locked up. Even if he finishes here, they're still going to win the Constructors Championship. But man, the fire that Max still has in him was really impressive to go chase down Charles and then Lewis. And so, yeah, I think on the grand scale, probably the most dominant season of all time, which from a competitive fandom standpoint, we don't want those every single year, but I think you have to sit back and respect it too.
The U.S. Grand Prix gives us an interesting finishing order, and then I was really bummed because driver of the day, in my mind, Max did an amazing job running those guys down, but at this point you're kind of like, hey, how about winning the trophy? That's your driver of the day. That you win driver of the day technically, but after Fernando Alonso goes on 2 wheels, and I just kept going back and watching in that wreck that Lance Stroll caused, in the middle of that racetrack, for that high speed of a crash to happen and nobody to be injured, and it was a really dramatic crash, and I thought more people were going to be affected by it. And I thought for sure Alonso's done for the day. That's when you rack that thing. He's going to be up on a truck, Instead, he goes and kind of careens into the wall, and you're like, okay, what's going to happen here? When I watched back, I kept going back and seeing him almost, airborne on that thing. And I would assume that there's some, NASCAR has made so many steps in the direction of making sure those cars don't flip over ever again. You can't do it 100%. But when I saw Alonso do that, I assumed that there were some things at play to make it to where these cars don't take off because they have the same type of a possibility to do it. And then the guy comes back and finishes 7th. I mean, insane. That only a former world champion can do that. But then he ends up getting the 30-second time penalty after everything was said and done because he was driving around with, a Ford Pinto. No mirror. No mirror. He's just busted up, which is, I started to think about it and I go, okay, from a safety standpoint, I guess. But Checo went, the whole race without that end plate on his front wing? I mean, and so you kind of go, I guess that's not a safety issue. But if something's dangling off of his car, which it was, I was surprised that they hit him with such a huge penalty. And then they didn't hit anybody else. And then George gets just that 5-second penalty for ruining Carlos Sainz's entire day.
Yeah. Alonso, what a lunatic. Like you said, he hits both left wheels into the wall and keeps his foot in it. He's like, I'm just going to keep going. And I'm just like, what? Yeah, it's really lucky he didn't go end over end. When two F1 cars touch wheel to wheel like that, it just creates that force, that reaction that just wants to pick one car up really high. So it could have been a lot worse. And the fact that they only had two cars really involved in the wreck, I think Lando Norris maybe picked up some damage in it, but and then Alonso coming back to finish where he did. Yeah, I'm with you. I feel like the 30-second time penalty was excessive. Having stuff that's a safety issue versus a performance issue, I understand that. Like the safety issue, like if they put out I think they call it like an orange flag or something on a driver and says you got to come in and fix that, and the team ignores it, I can understand the FI getting a little bit more upset. But I wish that had been a lower penalty for him and for 007 is I think what we're calling him now. George, he's got a license to kill and he's out there. It's like 007, 0 championship, 0 wins, 7 assassination attempts. He's just,
my gosh,
he's a weapon out there right
Everybody's
now,
so brutal. Yesterday after that whole thing, you text me and you were like, "Hey man, I don't know if I can get on board with Mercedes AMG after what George pulled." And I always hate hearing the radio on the because they get on the radio and they're all on their PR foot. They're like, he cut right in front of me. I don't know. I couldn't have done anything, and you're like, dude. And then Carlos is like, because he's getting from behind, he's just going, what just happened? Like, I have no idea what just happened. And then he's like, I'm punctured. I just got blasted from behind here. And for the guy to get his first career pole, and that's his first career pole, wasn't it? I think it was his. Maybe he's gotten another one, but
another one.
Either way, it was such a huge thing for him because everybody had sort of written him off, right? And it just shows you how much of an ego, how much of a competitive balance that there is, and how much, like, how good of a driver a guy like Carlos is on this team. It just has not panned out for him all year. His 6th DNF of the year for Ferrari. And most of the time it was just like engine blows up, gets blasted into from George Russell, and he keeps driving. I guess I don't understand. There's no other comparison, I think, in other sports when you ruin something like that for another team, the best I can think of in back in the way back machine, there was a Cotton Bowl in the 40s, and they have footage of it where a guy is running for a kick return. Do you recall this at all? There's a kick return.
I haven't heard this.
You got to look it up. It's interesting. A guy comes from the bench area and tackles the guy who was going down the field and was going to go down and score, obviously. And he ran back over onto the bench and kind of tried to hide behind some. Imagine if that would have happened in today's But what do? They have to take the ball. They're like, put the ball where he got hit, march it forward 15 yards for a 15-yard penalty. And then you go, no way, you're taking points away from this guy. You're doing all these things. There should be more. We got to do more for this guy. This guy should never be allowed to play football again. This guy,
egregious,
right?
Yeah.
And so I don't know. In that case, when you ruin somebody's race, and it's the guy who is fighting for points, the teams are fighting you really could. Mercedes is going to have to do a lot to run down Ferrari in these last 3 races to be able to maybe jump into that number 2 spot, but it's not impossible. And when you eliminate, when one of those drivers on Ferrari's side gets 0 points, then that's the kind of stuff that leads to these teams getting more. That's why I wish that something like that would get penalized more. When I saw it was just a 5-second stop during a pit, I was kind of pissed about it. But
yeah, I feel like if you're a driver who takes somebody out through just pure stupidity, you should have a penalty that almost takes you out of the race as well. I think of the Lewis Hamilton Max Verstappen clash at Silverstone last year, where Lewis kind of came a little bit wide through that line and clipped Max and sent him into the barriers, and Max ended up going to the hospital, and Lewis got a time penalty and still came back and won the race. That was another moment where I'm like, I just don't think it's right that Lewis can take a guy out, or any driver can take a guy out and still come back and win the race. But it's going to be interesting with Mercedes and Ferrari. The Constructors Championship tightened up, and they're only about 40 or 50 points behind them now. So that's going to be tight for 3 races.
As you walk through the rest of this thing, and from this weekend, you see some of the things that happened and some of the things that I think storyline-wise, to watch Seb in his final U.S. Grand Prix, everything is a thanks for everything Seb type of a weekend, but he's actually racing really well too. And for some reason, that Aston Martin was getting around Circuit of the Americas pretty well until Lance Stroll ruined it for everybody. But I like Seb is in a car that is below the performance that you've seen in his career in some of these cases. I think he's gotten, and this happens, we see it in sports, guys who are former world champions, guys who are at the top of the game, and for one reason or another, they're not at that performance level anymore. And I'm glad he's hanging it up because you see the flip side of guys like, Matt Ryan in the NFL or even Tom Brady now who come back and try to get it done. And their legacy gets tainted a little bit by just kind of being there for no other reason except for your name is big and so you can still stay in the sport. And so I'm glad he's going out on a good note and he's still racing really well.
Yeah, that fight with Kevin Magnussen on the last lap was some of the best racing we've seen all year through that third sector concourse of turns, which is a really cool track layout. I think kudos to Circuit of the Americas for designing a really exciting track. I feel like we've had probably a higher percentage of exciting finishes at COTA than almost anywhere else on the circuit. So kudos to the designers. But yeah, that last sector between him and Kevin, you hear Kevin afterwards saying, look, it sucks that I got beat out, but that was one of the coolest moments of my entire career. And he feels honored to be able to race beside Vettel like that. And just next to a guy who you can trust so much, that has just built the reputation that Seb has. And I think you're right. I think he's going out on a high note, although, we wish he's competing for wins. I do think he's getting more out of the car than, the average driver would get. So hopefully he can keep going and maybe in these last 3 races get a podium.
Carlos Sainz has the fewest laps finished out of the entire grid this year. And it's kind of not that close. So last year he finished at the top of the board. He finished 99.75 of the laps raced last year, which is exceptional, right? That means you've got to have reliability. They weren't necessarily in the fight, obviously. Ferrari, their car last year wasn't competitive, but they were at least staying in races, right? Carlos Sainz this year has raced in 75% of the laps of the entire season. He's missed a quarter of the laps that have been taken this season because of reliability issues. And it is. It's the, you do need, as the British put it, right, the rub of the green to be able to kind of put together an exceptional season. And if you're not in a car like Max Verstappen is and Checo is, where it's obviously more dominant of a setup, you have to have everything going for you to be able to finish. And Carlos has just had not enough of that. And it's just been an awful year for him considering what the car performance was like at the beginning of the year.
Yeah. I love Carlos. I think he's just one of the more popular drivers on the grid, and hopefully next year he gets a bit more luck. I can't believe he's finished fewer laps than Latifi. That blows my mind.
Yeah, I know. I thought the same thing, and it's not even Latifi's actually 12th on the grid of finished laps. So he takes it nice and easy and slow. Right.
He just doesn't want to hit anybody.
You've had reliability issues, yeah. And Zhou Guanyu is right up there at 19th. Vettel's actually finished the third fewest amount of laps. Albon after that, but you have some of those that you just go, I can't believe it. From a historic perspective, Max Verstappen has moved up into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 6th most wins in F1 history, and the guy is 27 years old and still has a lot of racing ahead of him. Lewis Hamilton leads that entire group by, he has 70 more wins.
It's insane.
More Grand Prix wins.
I don't think Max is going to catch him.
You don't think he's going to catch him?
I think in the new era, the cost cap era, I don't see Red Bull going on an 8-year tear. Yeah, I think that it's going to be more back and forth, and then it's just going to be hard to catch Lewis's record.
Behind him, of course, is Michael Schumacher with 91, and then it drops considerably to Sebastian Vettel at 53. So Seb is going to end his career right now tied for third all-time wins on the grid, and then Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna at 51 and 41 respectively. But Max Verstappen and Fernando Alonso, it's pretty cool because you have active drivers. You have Lewis Hamilton with the most ever, Sebastian Vettel third, and then 6th and 7th with Verstappen and Alonso there. It's nice to have guys who are racing right now. Out of those top, like I said, there's top 7. 4 of them are on the grid right now, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I think we're in an interesting stage of the Formula One life cycle of we still have these champions that are on the grid that are going to retire in the next, 2 to 3 years. And will F1 sufficiently replace those drivers with personalities that are, as interesting? I think NASCAR had this happen to them, and they didn't. They had like the Jeff Gordons, the Dale Earnhardts, Tony Stewart's, and then that cohort retired, and all the drivers who came after them just weren't interesting. And I think that the viewability and the interest in that series dropped a bunch. But I think that F1 has been really, great with obviously their approach to media and content to keep the excitement up and going. I mean, 440,000 people in attendance at Circuit of the Americas this last weekend, which is the record for a 3-day event in F1 history. And maybe the biggest sporting event of all time. I mean,
the US,
obviously it's across 3 days, but that's a fair amount. That's 150,000 people per day.
How many of those do you think are new? In the a lot of our listeners and myself who are in the last 4 or 5 years because of the Netflix series.
Oh, I have to think over half. I mean, it's doubled previous attendance from prior years, and so it's a ton of new. Ton of new fans.
I was just really glad to see Megan Thee Stallion and DJ Khaled on the grid walking around. What?
Shaq, Brad Pitt.
Now listen, Shaq he's loved racing. Brad Pitt, I think, is racing for a long time. DJ Khaled wouldn't be able to name more than 2 drivers on the grid, if that. Megan Thee Stallion has no business being. Maybe I'm cutting them short. Maybe they're as big of fans as F1 as so many Americans have become over the last few years. But that grid walk that Martin Brundle was doing, I was going through, no one wanted to talk to him. And I'm convinced it's because if they were asked anything about the actual race, they'd be like, I'm just here so I don't get fined. They would have no real answers for the media because I'm convinced that some of those celebrities are just there because they know they're going to get seen on TV.
Yeah, interesting thing I learned this weekend is that they actually put out a press list of who are going to be the celebrities and notable people at the race this weekend and who the media go up and talk to and who is exempt. And Brad Pitt was on the list as the media can't go up and talk to him.
Really?
Yeah, which I thought was interesting.
It's lame because I
think Martin Brundle, he doesn't care. He's going to go ask anyways.
That's half of the grid walk is him getting turned down by people. Oh, it looks like she doesn't want to speak to me. Yeah, I mean, Brad. Oh, I'm not allowed to talk to him? Oh, okay. Well, why not? You're down here on the grid. It's half the time it's just the approaching people that's just as funny to me. Who have been massive disappointments for you this year when you watch these races? And I'll ask 2 of them from a team perspective and then also from the individual racing perspective.
Yeah, that's a good question. From the team perspective, gosh, I had a lot of hope for Haas out of the gate. It was scoring points in their first few races. I was here we go. They're going to compete in the midfield, and unfortunately, they're 8th. AlphaTauri is just such a spread between Red Bull and their sister team that I don't know. Obviously, their budget is less, and they don't have the same driver talent, but I think AlphaTauri would be up further. I think those who've overperformed this year are Alpine and probably Alfa Romeo.
Yeah, Alpha's. Is that just because Valtteri's been such a stabilizing force there too? I mean, it has to be, even though he's had a lot of DNFs as well.
Yeah, and I think Zhou Guanyu's been, like you said, he's seems like he's been consistent. And yeah, Bottas has just, I think, been able to get some of those higher finishes, mid points, 5th. Not quite podium, but I think if you get a few of those in the mid pack, you can really boost your point total. And then I think on the driver's side, oh man, Yuki. I feel like Yuki should have taken a bigger. Going back to AlphaTauri, I feel like Yuki should have taken a bigger step this year than he has. You hear with was it Helmut Marko that said that next year Nick DeVries is going to be the number 1 driver. And Yuki still has to prove himself. That kind of sucks. He's been there for 2-3 years, and the rookie comes in, and the rookie gets to be, the team leader. So I think he's had not a great season.
I think Pierre Gasly staying on AlphaTauri, I think that's a guy who's underperformed massively. I mean, he's in 14th in the driver's standings, and 23 points. He's behind Kevin Magnussen in points. He's behind Daniel Ricciardo in points, and Sebastian Vettel in points, and Valtteri Bottas in points. And I don't know where that car really is, But, I mean, it's got that same Honda power unit in it. I know that they don't share everything across the board, but Pierre Gasly, who was like, I'm going to step up everything, and he took everything so personally when he lost that seat at Red Bull, and then he had the win at Monza a couple years ago, and then you go, holy cow, this guy – or was it last year? Now I'm like getting all my years mixed up. Either way.
That was 2 years ago.
2 years ago. And then since then, he has really kind of underperformed, and this year especially. Yuki, I always look at and go, you know what, he still needs some polishing, but I like him. But, Pierre Gasly's only scored 10 more points than his teammate has this year.
Yeah. And then, last but not least, Daniel Ricciardo in 12th in the driver standings.
That's a bummer.
In his interview yesterday, like, he was kind of, out of words. Like, he's like, I just, I don't know how I continue on it, if I'm going to be racing like this. Is like, he's got 3 races left. And he says that he's going to be around the grid next year, which I think means he's going to be a reserve driver. And wildest of all rumors is that he's going to be a reserve driver back at Red Bull. I don't understand that move for him because I don't think he's a better driver than Checo. I don't understand what his strategy is there other than maybe just trying to reserve driver for a year, be at the best team, and then up his, draft stock to get picked up by another team after he's spent a year with Red Bull.
Other disappointments on the grid for me from like a personal driver standpoint. And it's not because of anything else except for just kind of the circumstances that they were in, but he didn't beat his teammate this year. Lewis Hamilton has struggled against George Russell. Is that just because there's a little bit of disinterest from the world champ who just goes, you know what, like if I'm not first, like you might as well make me last. I'm not as interested if I'm not going to be a competitive car.
Yeah, it seems like he kind of didn't have the fire in him at the beginning of the year.
He saw the writing on the wall with the car, right? I mean, that was kind of it.
I think it was just kind of a ton of disappointment in the first third of the season, and then now as he's challenging for these wins, I feel like he's going to get the fire back in him. I was really pulling for him to win yesterday, and like I said, I thought coming out with that 4-second lead and the hard tires with like 20-some-odd laps to go, I was like, oh, there's no way these mediums are going to hold up for Max, and even if Max gets around him, Lewis will fight back. But Red Bull just is able to maintain their tires like nobody else, and everyone else falls off. And so, yeah, it was close. I don't think that – I think what yesterday showed is that, the grid needs more than just like one mess up from Red Bull in order to win. Like they need a mess up plus like some more performance advantages.
You're not going to see Lando Norris move up anywhere in the driver's standings. He's probably going to stay in that 7th spot because he's 100 points off of or 90 points off of Lewis. And I don't see Esteban Ocon, running him down. By the way, yeah, that Alpine team has been fantastic this year compared to what we probably thought they were going to do. Ocon's had a tremendous year at that 8th spot in the driver's standings. But I was bummed at Lando, and this is more on the car than it is on Lando, I think. But I was pissed that Lando didn't get his first win yet. He still has those 2 second places in his career. He has a handful of podiums, and it's just he can't seem to. It's just like the car hasn't matched up this year. When they had moments, it just ended up not being good enough. And I'm bummed for him because he's got such a bright future still. But then at some point, you're not the youngest guy on the grid anymore, and you're not getting all the. Well, he's 18, he's fine. It'll come around. You wonder at what point he's going to be able to get that win if McLaren can't figure it out.
Yeah. Again, fan favorite that I'm sure everybody wants to see win, and I don't think it's going to be this year. I think McLaren's been on the disappointing side of things, and hopefully next year they can pick it back up and be more competitive because there's a lot of McLaren fans here in the U.S. as well.
Checo heads home for a home race in Mexico City. That's where the next race is going to be. Where does this race stack up, and what happens at this Mexican race, and where is it historically? I mean, it's been on the grid for a long time, but Mexico is a place that people really love to see where that race is. I think it's cool that the grandstand's right there in that center of the city, and it's an awesome finish to the race, start-finish to the race. So, what do you expect out of Mexico and F1 and the grid showing up to Mexico City?
Yeah, Mexico is it's kind of a more of a low downforce track. It's got, I think, the longest front stretch in F1. If not, it's close to it. It's super long, and so you got to have the car trimmed out to get that high speed. there's a lot of really interesting analysis out there about which cars have the highest speed, and Williams most races and Alfa Romeo have the highest average top speed. But then, obviously they need a little bit more downforce because they're still, getting crushed by Red Bull. So it's going to be interesting. I think it'll probably play a lot like maybe Spa did. And we'll probably see Red Bull back up front. If Ferrari can get their tire degradation stuff figured out, I think they have the pace, especially in a low downforce track, to beat Red Bull. But that they just got to figure out their tire situation.
All right, so we get ready for Mexico, and we're going to have another episode drop this week where we kind of break down a few more things inside of the car. We're going to force Dan to do some homework on any part of the car he wants to teach us about. I frankly am looking forward to some of the changes that happen. I want to know what regulations could shift next year for this car. The stuff that that F1 and the FIA might look at and say, oh, we might have to end up changing a few of these things here and there. So, Dan, are you up for the challenge of some extra homework this week?
Oh, always. I love homework.
You are a great student. Don't deny it. Come on. So we'll get you ready for that one. We appreciate you listening to Mode Push. We put a lot of work into this thing, and we try to make sure we can get in and get you a couple episodes a week during the season. So for Dan, I'm Alex. Thanks for being with us. We'll be back again later on this week in a few days. Check the old downloads because you'll be able to get some new episodes. Tell a friend. Teach a neighbor about F1 and what we're doing on this podcast here. So for Dan, I'm Alex. We'll see you next time, everybody.